I still remember the exact moment I realized the fog was moving wrong. It was my third week as a night watchman in Whitechapel, and I had grown accustomed to the thick London mist that rolled through the narrow streets like a living thing. But on that particular night in March of 1889, I watched the fog pull back from a darkened alley entrance, as if something had breathed it away from the inside. No wind stirred the papers scattered along the cobblestones, yet the fog retreated, curling back upon itself in a way that defied every natural law I had ever known. I stood there, with my lantern raised, watching that impossible movement, and I felt the first cold finger of true fear trace its way down my spine. What I did not know then, what I could not possibly have understood in that frozen moment of recognition, was that this was only the beginning. My name is Walter, and I am 42 years old, though some days I feel ancient beyond measure. I came to London from Boston in the winter of 1889, fleeing a failed marriage and a string of poor business decisions that had left me nearly penniless. A distant cousin had secured me the position as night watchman for a textile warehouse in Whitechapel, a job that paid little but required even less. All I had to do was walk the perimeter of the building 4 times each night, check the locks on the doors and windows, and make certain no one broke in to steal the bolts of fabric stored inside. It seemed simple enough, almost too simple for a man of my education and former station, but pride is a luxury afforded only to those who can pay for their meals, and I had long since exhausted my reserves of both money and dignity. Before we go any further into what happened to me in those dark London streets, I want to ask you something. Have you ever experienced something you could not explain? Something that made you question everything you thought you knew about the world? If you have, I would love to hear about it in the comments below. Share your stories with me, because after you hear mine, you will understand why I need to know I am not alone in this. The warehouse stood on the corner of Dorset Street and Crispin Street, a 3-story brick building that had weathered decades of London's industrial grime until its walls had turned the color of old bruises. The surrounding neighborhood was a warren of narrow lanes and cramped tenements, home to the poorest of the city's poor. This was Jack the Ripper's hunting ground, though by the time I arrived, the murders had ceased, or so everyone believed. The official investigation had gone cold, and the newspapers had moved on to fresher scandals, but the people of Whitechapel had not forgotten. They walked quickly after dark, eyes downcast, and they did not linger in doorways or alleys. The fear remained, thick and tangible as the fog itself. My first 2 weeks passed without incident. I arrived at the warehouse each evening at 10 o'clock, received the keys from the day manager, and began my rounds. The building was always empty by the time I started my shift, the workers having departed hours earlier. I would walk the perimeter every 2 hours, checking doors and windows with my lantern held high, listening for any sounds of intrusion. Between rounds, I sat in the small office on the ground floor, reading newspapers by candlelight and trying not to think about how far I had fallen from my previous life. It was on my 15th night that I first noticed something unusual. I had completed my midnight round and was returning to the office when I heard singing, not the raucous songs of drunkards stumbling home from the pubs, but something softer, almost melodic, a woman's voice, high and clear, singing what sounded like a lullaby. The words were indistinct, muffled by distance and the ever-present fog, but the tune carried through the night air with crystalline clarity. I stopped walking and turned toward the sound. It seemed to be coming from somewhere near the back of the warehouse, in the direction of the old cemetery that bordered the property. I raised my lantern and peered into the darkness, but I could see nothing beyond the circle of yellow light that surrounded me. The singing continued for perhaps 30 seconds more, then stopped abruptly, cut off as cleanly as if someone had closed a door. I stood there for several minutes, listening, but heard nothing more. Eventually, I convinced myself that it had been nothing more than a woman singing to her child in one of the nearby tenements, the sound carried strangely by the fog and the narrow streets. I returned to the office and tried to put it out of my mind, but the singing returned the next night, at almost exactly the same time. And the night after that, and the night after that, always between midnight and 1 o'clock in the morning. Always the same melody, though I could never quite make out the words. Always ending abruptly after half a minute or so. I began to anticipate it, checking my pocket watch as midnight approached, waiting for that eerie lullaby to drift through the darkness. I tried to locate the source several times, walking toward the sound with my lantern held high, but it always seemed to move away from me, staying just beyond the reach of my light. Or perhaps it was stationary, and I was simply unable to properly judge direction in the disorienting maze of Whitechapel's streets. On my 20th night, I mentioned the singing to another watchman I had met during my rounds. His name was Edmund, a grizzled man in his 60s who had been working the night watch in Whitechapel for more than 20 years. We sometimes shared a flask of tea in the early morning hours, standing on opposite corners and talking across the empty street. When I described the woman's voice, Edmund's face changed. The casual friendliness drained away, replaced by something harder and more guarded. "You hear it from behind your warehouse?" he asked. "Yes. Near the old cemetery, I think." Edmund was quiet for a long moment, staring past me into the fog. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and careful. "That is not a living woman you are hearing," he said. "That is Catherine." "Catherine?" "Catherine Eddowes, one of the Ripper's victims. She was found in Mitre Square, not far from here, back in September of '88. Throat cut, body mutilated in ways I will not describe. They say she used to sing that same lullaby to her children before she lost them to the workhouse." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air. "But that is impossible. The dead do not sing." Edmund gave me a look that was equal parts pity and warning. "You are new here, Walter. You do not understand Whitechapel yet. This place has been soaked in blood and misery for so long that sometimes the past does not stay buried the way it should. My advice to you is this: do not investigate the singing. Do not try to find its source. Do your rounds, keep to your schedule, and when you hear Catherine's lullaby, you pretend you hear nothing at all. Some doors are better left closed." He left me then, walking away into the fog with his lantern swinging at his side. I stood there on the empty street, my tea growing cold in my hands, and I felt the weight of his words settling over me like a shroud. I wish I could tell you that I followed Edmund's advice. I wish I could say that I simply ignored the singing and went about my duties like a sensible man. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and the mystery of that voice had burrowed into my mind like a worm into an apple. I needed to know the truth, even if some part of me already suspected that the truth would be more terrible than any lie. The next night, I prepared differently for my shift. I brought an extra lantern, more oil, and a compass I had purchased from a pawn shop that afternoon. I also brought something else, a small notebook and pencil, in which I planned to record my observations. If I was going to investigate this phenomenon, I would do it methodically, scientifically. I would gather evidence and draw conclusions based on fact, not superstition. At midnight, right on schedule, the singing began. I left the warehouse immediately, walking toward the sound with both lanterns lit. I had decided to approach from a different direction this time, circling around to the east instead of walking straight toward the back of the building. My theory was that if the sound was indeed coming from the cemetery, I might be able to approach it from an unexpected angle. The fog was particularly thick that night, reducing visibility to perhaps 10 feet in any direction. The light from my lanterns seemed to die just beyond their glass, swallowed by the gray murk that pressed in from all sides. I walked slowly, carefully, counting my steps and checking my compass regularly. The singing continued, that same haunting melody, and I tried to focus on it, to use it as a guide. I had walked perhaps 200 yards when I realized something disturbing. According to my compass, I had been walking in a straight line, but according to the landmarks I could dimly perceive through the fog, I had somehow circled back toward the warehouse. I stood at the corner of Dorset Street again, exactly where I had started. I checked my compass. The needle pointed steadily north, just as it should. But the warehouse was to my south now, which meant I had turned around at some point without realizing it, except I knew I had not turned around. I had walked in a straight line, following the compass, counting my steps. The singing stopped. The silence that followed was profound and unsettling. I stood there in the fog, both lanterns burning, and I realized that I could hear nothing. No footsteps from distant pedestrians, no sounds of horses or carriages, no dogs barking, no voices from the tenements, nothing. It was as if the entire city had been wrapped in wool, all sound muffled and deadened. Then I heard footsteps. They came from somewhere ahead of me, in the direction I had been walking. Slow, deliberate footsteps on cobblestones, each one distinct and clear in the suffocating silence. I raised my lanterns and called out, "Who is there?" No answer, but the footsteps continued, coming closer. I should have run. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to turn around and sprint back to the safety of the warehouse. But I was frozen, paralyzed by a combination of fear and morbid curiosity. I stood there with my lanterns raised, watching the fog, waiting for whoever or whatever was approaching to step into the light. A figure emerged from the gray murk. It was a woman. She wore a dark dress and shawl, both so tattered and stained that it was impossible to determine their original color. Her face was turned downward, hidden by her hair, but I could see that she was barefoot. Her feet were pale and dirty, and they made no sound as she walked toward me across the cobblestones. The footsteps I had heard continued, but they were not synchronized with her movements. She stopped perhaps 15 feet away from me, just at the edge of my lantern light. For a long moment, she did not move. Then, slowly, she raised her head and looked at me. I want to pause here and tell you something. If you are finding this story compelling, if you are curious about what I saw in that woman's face, please consider subscribing to this channel. I share these experiences not for fame or profit, but because I need others to bear witness to what I have seen. I need to know that these words will reach people, that my testimony will not simply vanish into the void like so many of the poor souls who disappeared in Whitechapel's streets. Your subscription means more to me than you know. The woman's face was ruined, not by violence or disease, but by something worse, by absence. Where her features should have been, there was only a smooth expanse of pale skin, like a half-finished sculpture. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just blank, featureless flesh that should not have been able to see me or speak to me or sing lullabies in the night. Yet I knew she was looking at me. I felt the weight of her gaze, heavy and cold as a tombstone. The footsteps stopped. We stood there in the fog, the faceless woman and I, separated by 15 feet of empty air that suddenly felt like the most important distance in the world. I wanted to run. Every fiber of my being demanded that I turn and flee, but I could not move. My legs would not obey me. My body had become a prison, and I was trapped inside it, forced to stare at that impossible, terrible face. Then the woman spoke. Her voice came from somewhere other than where her mouth should have been. It seemed to emanate from the fog itself, from the stones beneath my feet, from the air between us. It was the same voice I had been hearing each night, the voice that sang the lullaby, but now it formed words. "You should not be here." I tried to answer, but my throat had gone dry. I managed only a strangled croak. "They said you were dead," I finally gasped. "Edmund said you were Catherine Eddowes. He said the Ripper killed you." "I am not Catherine," the faceless woman said. "I am everyone. I am all of them. Every woman who died in these streets, every body that was found in the morning with her throat cut and her insides torn out. I am the collective scream that no one heard, the suffering that no one acknowledged, the fear that was dismissed as hysteria. I am what remains when justice fails and mercy dies." The fog around her began to move, swirling in patterns that hurt to watch. Other shapes emerged from the gray murk, indistinct and shadowy, but undeniably human in form. Women, dozens of them, appearing at the edges of my vision like half-remembered dreams. They surrounded me in a loose circle, none of them quite solid, all of them watching with eyes I could not see. "Why are you showing yourself to me?" I asked. My voice sounded small and pathetic even to my own ears. "Because you asked to see," the faceless woman replied. "Because you refused to look away. Most men walk past us every day, past the places where we died, past the stones that are still stained with our blood, and they see nothing. They have trained themselves not to see. But you are different, Walter. You are curious. You want to know. So we show you. What do you want from me?" The faceless woman tilted her head, a gesture that would have been almost human if not for the horrible absence where her features should have been. "We want what we have always wanted. We want to be seen. We want to be remembered. We want the world to know that we were here, that we mattered, that our deaths meant something more than a few days of newspaper headlines, and then silence. We want justice, Walter." But justice is a luxury the poor can never afford, and the dead can never claim. The shadowy figures around me moved closer, tightening their circle. I could feel the temperature dropping, the cold seeping through my clothes and into my bones. My breath came out in clouds of vapor that hung in the air like ghosts. "I do not understand," I said. "What can I do? I am just a night watchman. I have no power, no influence. I cannot give you justice." "Then give us witness," the faceless woman said. "Remember us. Tell our stories. Make certain that the world does not forget that we were real, that we lived and suffered and died in these streets while the great city around us looked the other way." Before I could respond, the woman raised one pale hand and pointed past me, toward the warehouse. "But first, you must understand what you are guarding." I turned to look, though some part of me did not want to. The warehouse stood perhaps 50 yards away, its bulk darker than the surrounding fog. As I watched, lights began to appear in its windows. Not the warm yellow glow of lanterns, but something colder and more sickly. A greenish phosphorescence that pulsed like a heartbeat. "What is that?" I whispered. "The truth," the faceless woman said. "Go and see for yourself, Walter. Go and see what your employers have hidden in the basement, beneath all those bolts of fabric and barrels of dye. Go and see why they needed a night watchman who would not ask questions, a desperate man from another country who had nowhere else to turn. Go and see, and then decide whether you will continue to guard their secrets or become our witness." The shadowy figures began to fade, dissolving back into the fog like sugar in water. The faceless woman was the last to go, her blank visage turned toward me until the very end. Then she too was gone, and I was alone on the street with my 2 lanterns and the terrible knowledge that I had a choice to make. I stood there for a long time, shivering in the cold, staring at those strange lights pulsing in the warehouse windows. Every rational part of my mind was telling me to run, to abandon this job and this cursed neighborhood and return to America on the first ship I could book passage on. But curiosity, that fatal human flaw, had me in its grip now. I needed to know what was in that basement. I needed to understand why the dead women of Whitechapel had chosen to reveal themselves to me. I walked back to the warehouse. The front door was locked, just as I had left it, and nothing seemed disturbed. But when I entered the building, I immediately sensed that something had changed. The air felt different, heavier somehow, charged with a tension that made the hair on my arms stand up. The strange green lights I had seen from outside were no longer visible, but I could feel their presence, a wrongness that permeated the very walls. I made my way to the main floor, where the bulk of the fabric inventory was stored. Everything appeared normal. Rows of shelves stacked with bolts of cloth, barrels of dye powder, crates of buttons and thread. My footsteps echoed in the large space as I walked between the aisles, lantern held high, searching for anything unusual. It took me 20 minutes to find the entrance to the basement. It was hidden behind a stack of empty crates in the northwest corner of the building, a trap door set into the floor and concealed beneath a layer of sawdust. I never would have found it if I had not been looking specifically for something hidden. The door itself was made of heavy oak planks bound with iron, and it had no handle or ring, just a small keyhole. I tried the ring of keys the day manager had given me. The third key fit the lock. The door was heavy, and I had to strain to lift it. When I finally got it open, a smell wafted up from below that made me gag, a mixture of chemicals, decay, and something else I could not immediately identify. I covered my nose and mouth with my handkerchief and held my lantern over the opening. Wooden stairs descended into darkness. I could see nothing beyond the first few steps. I should have closed the door and walked away. I should have gone to the police, or at least to Edmund, and told them what I had found. But the compulsion to see, to know, was overwhelming now. It had become more than curiosity. It felt like obligation, like something I owed to the faceless woman and her shadowy companions. I descended the stairs. The basement was larger than I had expected, extending beneath the entire footprint of the warehouse. The ceiling was low, forcing me to walk with my head slightly bowed. Support pillars marched away into the darkness at regular intervals, and the floor was bare earth rather than stone or wood. My lantern light reflected off moisture on the walls, creating a shifting pattern of shadows that made it difficult to judge distances or dimensions. The smell was worse down here, thick and cloying, catching in my throat with every breath. I moved slowly, carefully, sweeping my lantern from side to side to illuminate as much of the space as possible. I had walked perhaps 30 feet when I saw the first table. It was a long wooden workbench, and it was covered with glass jars. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, arranged in neat rows and filled with clear liquid. I approached cautiously and raised my lantern to see what the jars contained. Organs, human organs, preserved in what I assumed was formaldehyde or some similar chemical. Hearts, livers, sections of intestine, pieces that I could not immediately identify. Each jar was carefully labeled with a tag that included a date, a set of initials, and a series of numbers. My hands were shaking now, making the lantern light dance and flicker across the table. I looked at the dates on the tags. September 1888, November 1888, February 1889. The initials varied: C, E, M, K, E, S, and others I did not recognize. I moved to the next table. More jars, but these contained different specimens, cross-sections of tissue, samples of skin, things that had clearly been cut from human bodies with surgical precision. And between the tables, I saw something else. Medical instruments. Scalpels, saws, forceps, needles. All of them clean and neatly arranged, as if waiting to be used again. This was not a storage basement. This was a laboratory, a place where someone had been conducting experiments on human tissue, on pieces of bodies that could only have come from one source. The women who had been murdered in Whitechapel. I felt bile rising in my throat. I turned away from the tables, desperate for fresh air, and that is when I saw the shelves. They lined the far wall of the basement, built from floor to ceiling, and they held books. Hundreds of books, thick volumes bound in leather, their spines labeled with dates and numbers. I approached them on shaking legs and pulled one down at random. It was a journal, written in a neat, precise hand. The entries were dated, starting in August of 1888, and they detailed a series of experiments. The writer, who never identified himself by name, described his theories about human anatomy, about the relationship between the mind and the body, about the nature of life and death. He wrote about his need for specimens, about the difficulty of obtaining fresh tissue for his studies, and then he wrote about the murders, not as crimes, but as opportunities. He described following women through the streets of Whitechapel, selecting his subjects based on their age and physical condition. He wrote about the acts themselves with clinical detachment, noting which incisions had been most effective, which organs had yielded the most interesting samples. He wrote about bringing the specimens here, to this basement, where he could study them at his leisure without fear of discovery. He wrote about how easy it had been, how no one cared about dead prostitutes in Whitechapel, how the police were incompetent, and the public was far more interested in sensational theories about foreign doctors or mad aristocrats than in the simple truth that sometimes a monster is just a man with a sharp knife and too much curiosity about what is inside other people. The journal trembled in my hands. I looked at the date of the last entry, the 10th of March, 1889. 5 days ago, the murders had not stopped. The killer was still active. And I was working as night watchman for his laboratory, guarding his secrets, making certain no one disturbed his work. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I stumbled backward, dropping the journal, and my lantern slipped from my shaking hand. It hit the ground and the glass shattered, spraying oil across the dirt floor. The flame caught immediately, and suddenly there was fire spreading across the basement floor, racing toward the wooden support pillars and the shelves of journals. I ran for the stairs. Behind me, I could hear the fire growing, the crackle of burning wood and paper, the whoosh of flames finding new fuel. I took the steps 3 at a time, burst through the trap door, and kept running. I did not stop to close the door or lock it. I did not stop for my coat or my other lantern. I ran out of the warehouse and into the fog-shrouded streets, my only thought to get as far away as possible before the building became an inferno. I had made it perhaps 2 blocks when I heard the explosion. The fire must have reached the barrels of dye powder stored on the main floor, chemicals that were far more volatile than I had realized. The blast lit up the night sky, turning the fog briefly orange and red. I felt the heat of it on my face, even at this distance. I kept running. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, until I collapsed in an alley somewhere near Commercial Street, gasping for breath and shaking with shock and horror. Eventually, I heard bells in the distance, the fire brigade, too late to save anything but perhaps the neighboring buildings. When I finally had the strength to stand, I walked to Edmund's corner. I found him there, staring at the orange glow in the sky, his face grim. "Your warehouse is burning," he said without looking at me. "I know. Did you do it?" "Yes." Edmund was quiet for a moment, then he nodded slowly. "Good. That place was evil. I always suspected, but I could never prove anything. Too many men with too much power and money protecting whatever was inside. The organs," I said. "The journals. He documented everything. It is all gone now. Are you going to tell the police?" I thought about that. I thought about trying to explain what I had found, about the impossibility of providing evidence now that everything had burned. I thought about the powerful men who had employed me, who had clearly known what they were protecting. I thought about how quickly a desperate American with no friends or resources would be made into a convenient scapegoat. "No," I said. "I am going to disappear." Edmund nodded again. "Probably wise. But before you go, you should know something. Catherine Eddowes, the woman I told you about, she was not buried in any marked grave. None of them were. They were buried in paupers' graves, unmarked and forgotten. Their families could not afford headstones or proper memorials. So if you want to do right by them, if you want to honor what they showed you, you will need to find another way." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small notebook, which he handed to me. "Their names," he said. "All of them. The ones who died, and the ones the police claimed died of other causes but who I know disappeared around the same time as the famous murders. 43 women in total, over the course of 3 years. Remember them, Walter. Tell people what happened to them. Make certain the world knows that they mattered." I took the notebook with hands that were still shaking. I looked at the first page, saw the names written there in Edmund's careful script, and I felt the weight of responsibility settling onto my shoulders like a physical burden. I left London 3 days later, booking passage on a merchant ship bound for New York. I told no one where I was going. I simply vanished, another anonymous figure swallowed by the city's vastness. The warehouse fire was ruled an accident, caused by a careless night watchman who had apparently fled the scene. A warrant was issued for my arrest, but I was already gone. I returned to America and tried to rebuild my life. I found work in Boston, remarried eventually, had children. I tried to forget what I had seen in that basement, the jars of organs and the journals full of clinical descriptions of murder. I tried to forget the faceless woman and her shadowy companions, tried to tell myself that it had all been a hallucination brought on by stress and fear, but I could not forget. And every night, just after midnight, I would sometimes hear singing. That same lullaby, faint and distant, as if coming from very far away. A reminder of the promise I had made, the obligation I had accepted. For 30 years, I kept Edmund's notebook hidden, unable to look at it but unable to throw it away. I told no one about what I had seen in Whitechapel, fearful that speaking of it would somehow make me complicit in those terrible crimes. But now I am an old man, and I have come to understand that silence is its own form of complicity. By saying nothing, by keeping those names locked away in a drawer, I have been just as guilty of forgetting those women as the society that ignored their murders in the first place. So I am breaking my silence now. I am telling you this story, and I am sharing the names that Edmund gave me all those years ago. I am bearing witness, finally, to what I saw and what I learned in the fog-shrouded streets of Whitechapel. Here are their names: Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. These 5 are the ones history remembers, the canonical victims of Jack the Ripper. But there were others, so many others who died in those same streets during those same years. Women whose murders were attributed to other causes or simply ignored because their lives were judged to have too little value to warrant investigation. Rose Milett, Alice Mackenzie, Frances Coles, Emma Smith, Martha Tabram, and 33 others whose names I will not list here, not because they are less important, but because this story is already long enough, and I fear losing your attention before I reach the end. But their names are recorded. Edmund made certain of that. And now I am making certain that his record survives, that these women are not forgotten, that the world knows they existed, and that their deaths mattered. If you have stayed with me this far, if you have listened to this entire story, I want to thank you. I know it has not been easy. I know these are dark truths, uncomfortable realities that many would prefer to ignore. But by listening, by bearing witness alongside me, you are helping to fulfill the promise I made to the faceless woman in the fog. You are helping to ensure that these victims are seen, are remembered, are honored. If you found this story meaningful, please share it. Not because I seek attention or acclaim, but because these names deserve to be spoken, these lives deserve to be acknowledged. Every share, every comment, every moment of reflection helps to pull these women out of the darkness of history and into the light of remembrance. I am 72 years old now, and I do not have much time left. My health is failing, and I know that soon I will cross over into whatever lies beyond this life. When I do, I hope to meet those women again, the ones who showed themselves to me in the fog. I hope they will forgive me for taking so long to speak, for keeping their names hidden for 3 decades, while I hid from my own fear and shame. But mostly, I hope they will know that I did not forget. I hope they will understand that they have haunted me every day since I fled London, not with malice, but with the simple weight of their unfinished stories, their unacknowledged suffering. They deserved better than they received in life, and they deserved better than silence in death. I have one final thing to tell you, something I have not shared with anyone, not even my wife of 27 years. Something that happened just last week, which made me finally decide to record this testimony. I was sitting in my study late at night, unable to sleep as I so often am these days. The house was dark and quiet, my wife and children long since retired to bed. I sat by the window, looking out at the street below, and I heard singing, that same lullaby, Catherine's lullaby, or perhaps the collective lullaby of all those forgotten women. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. I turned toward the sound, and there, standing in the shadows at the corner of my property, I saw a figure. It was the faceless woman. She had followed me across the ocean and across 3 decades. She had waited patiently while I tried to forget, while I built a new life and pretended that what I had seen in Whitechapel was not real. And now, at the end of my life, she had come to collect on my promise. She did not speak. She simply stood there in the shadows, her blank face turned toward my window, and I understood what she wanted. I understood that it was time to stop hiding, time to stop pretending, time to finally bear witness the way I had promised I would. So I am writing this testimony. I am recording every detail I can remember, every name Edmund gave me, every terrible truth I learned in that basement laboratory beneath the textile warehouse. I am putting it all down on paper, and I am arranging for it to be made public after my death, not for my own legacy, but for theirs, so that the world will know what happened to them, so that justice, even if it comes a century too late, will finally have its voice. The faceless woman is still there. I can see her through my window right now, standing in the same spot she has occupied every night for the past week, waiting, watching, making certain I complete this task. I do not fear her. I understand now that she and her companions are not vengeful spirits seeking to harm the living. They are simply the accumulated weight of injustice, the collective grief of lives cut short and suffering ignored. They appear to those who have the courage, or perhaps the misfortune, to truly see them. And once seen, they cannot be unseen. Once acknowledged, they cannot be ignored. This is my burden and my privilege, to be their witness, to speak their names, to make certain that the world remembers. I was the night watchman in 1889 London. I was hired to guard a building that housed unspeakable evil. I failed in that duty, but perhaps I succeeded in a more important one. I remembered. I bore witness. And now, through this testimony, you are bearing witness alongside me. Do not forget them. Do not let their names fade back into the darkness. They were real. They lived. They suffered. They died. And they deserve to be remembered. The fog is rolling in now, even here in Boston, thousands of miles from Whitechapel's narrow streets. It moves strangely, pulling back from certain places as if something is breathing it away from the inside. The faceless woman has stepped closer to my window. I can see her more clearly now, and I realize that she is not alone. There are others with her, shadowy figures gathering in the fog, all of them turning their faces, or the places where their faces should be, toward me. They are waiting for me to finish, so I will end this testimony now with one final thought. If you are someone who has the power to investigate, to research, to shine light into dark places, I urge you to look into the warehouse fire that occurred on Dorset Street in Whitechapel on the 15th of March, 1889. Look into the men who owned that building, the men who employed me and others like me. Follow the money, follow the connections, and you will find a web of corruption and complicity that extends far beyond one mad doctor and his basement laboratory. The names of the victims are known. Edmund made certain of that. But the names of the men who enabled these murders, who protected the killer, who built that basement laboratory and filled it with instruments of torture, disguised as medical tools, those names remain hidden in the shadows of history. Find them, expose them. Let the light of truth finally reach into those dark corners where wealth and power have hidden their complicity. This is my final testimony. This is my witness. And now, as the faceless woman reaches toward my window and the fog presses against the glass, I am ready to join them, ready to cross over and finally rest. Remember their names. Remember what happened in Whitechapel. And never, ever look away from injustice simply because its victims are poor or powerless or already dead. The fog is inside my study now. The faceless woman is standing beside my desk. She reaches out one pale hand, and I am not afraid. I kept my promise. I bore witness. And now, at last, I am free.